Welcome to the Genealogy Happy Hour, a place where new family historians can learn to document their family histories and celebrate their new discoveries. I'm Amy.
And I'm Penny, and we're here to help you discover your family tree from the beginning.
Welcome to episode 54. Today we're going to be discussing searching for female ancestors. But before we begin, Penny, what wine do we have today?
Well, it's summer, it's hot, and we like rosé in the summer. If you've been listening to us for a while, you know that. So this month we have from the Côte de Provence, Domaine Bouchard from 2018. And did you love how I just threw out my French?
I was very impressed. Very impressed.
So that is really Domaine, D-O-M-A-I-N-E, Bouchard, Houchart, and it is a 90 points. And the description on Wine Enthusiast was good, so I thought I'd throw that out there. And it says it's a classic blend, is full and ripe with a touch of caramel as well as raspberry flavors. And who doesn't love caramel and raspberry? So it's delicious, and it's hot here in Florida, so it's good. It's good for summer.
Definitely always go to a rosé in the summer. For sure. All right. Well, today we're going to be discussing researching our female ancestors, which can be challenging at times. And joining us in our discussion today is Lisa Lisson from the blog Are You My Cousin?
Yeah, and Lisa also has a YouTube channel where she has a variety of videos on different genealogical topics, and a great website, Are You My Cousin, her blog, and so she's going to jump in here and talk to us. Well, welcome, Lisa, to our little podcast here, and really appreciate you joining us.
Oh, well, thank you for having me. I've really been looking forward to talking with you guys and talking about one of my favorite genealogy topics.
The women in our families, right?
Women, yes, finding those female ancestors.
All right, so let's just jump into it. What are some of the reasons that we cannot find these women?
Well, certainly I think part of the reason is, they didn't necessarily create a lot of their own records. Particularly, we don't have to go that far back in history when women really were not creating that many of their formal records. So we're not finding as many of them in the records. And then you throw in a few name changes. So if one of our ancestors got married and she took up her husband's name, so she has another name. But then think about what happened if that first husband passed away, and maybe she remarried again. So you could easily come up with 2 or 3 or even more surnames for a female. And it's tricky sometimes. It's easy to lose track of that ancestor in the records when if you don't find all the husbands, you don't find all the names that she was using. So it can be a little tricky sometimes.
I think even also going back, like you said, pre-1850, when the census only lists the head of household.
Absolutely.
Makes it even more difficult.
Absolutely.
Unless we're lucky and maybe she was widowed at that point, and then her name would be listed as the head of household.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So one of the things that Penny and I love to do is roll up our sleeves and do some on-site courthouse research. But when you do that for your female ancestors, you shouldn't really be always. You need to look for their names, but whose records will we find them in?
Well, you definitely you want to look for their names, but then you really kind of want to shift your focus. And I like to look for their husbands and look for their fathers or even their brothers, because sometimes what we find is those female ancestors in the records of her male, a prominent male in her life. Now, typically we think of that as being a husband if she's married. So she could potentially be named in a land record, in a will, and an estate record. Certainly we would think about marriage records, those types of records. I can also find evidence. I think we find them sometimes in evidence of a parent's will. And sometimes you'll find that married name thrown in that parent's will if she has already married or had children at that point. So we have to kind of look at those men who were in her life and research around them. To be honest, sometimes I just kind of have to make an educated, shall I say, guess as to maybe a potential husband or a potential father. and then I'll just research him out to determine, is he or is he not part of her family.
Agree. So, and it's also the social history is important to female ancestors. Why do you think it's so important in researching them?
Oh, I love social history. It's so important because even though our female ancestors were not necessarily creating a lot of what I call formal records, such as in the courts and wills and those types of things, they were absolutely living their lives. They were creating their own footprint, so to speak, within their communities. So you can find evidence of them as the communicators in the family. So they very well might be the letter writers of the family. They might be the ones who kept the family Bible. They might be the ones who kept the photographs. So these really aren't going to appear in those courthouse records, but they might appear in special collections at an archives site or a digital archive site. They might be within family records. Sometimes you find them in small local museums. I have found evidence there of those types of records. You can even find evidence of your ancestors. I love this one, the female ancestors, in cookbooks, so community cookbooks. Have you ever thought that they might be there? Because think about that. Now, I research in the South. I know you guys do too. And so a lot of the little local churches, the world would have created small church cookbooks. And it was basically a fundraiser, typically. And it was a way to create a cookbook. It was a way to create, maybe they were trying to earn money for something at the church or something for missionaries. It could have been a community type cookbook. And so all the women would donate or contribute a recipe. Well, now, they didn't have to, I suppose, but, think about it. If you're a woman in an organization, would you not donate or contribute a recipe? Because if you didn't, what would the other women think about you? Would they think that you're not a very good cook?
Right.
Would they think that you're not a good housekeeper? And at that time, that was important. Could have been very important. And so you can find evidence of the women in for those organizations. And so the cookbook can sometimes actually almost act like a roster for an organization, for a church, for a church women's group. And these are not, we think of these as modern records, and I think they are in some respects for these church cookbooks or these community cookbooks, but I have found church cookbooks well back into the 1800s over on Google Books. And it's a wonderful way to document a woman's place. And you can find sometimes multiple generations of women within the same cookbook.
I love that idea. Yeah, that's a wonderful suggestion. It reminds me when you were talking about that, because the women, that was your badge of honor, was you had to be, women were expected to be good cooks, and it's a sort of a family pride type of thing. I have my grandmother and great grandmother were members of the community women's club. And oftentimes, and in those, they published, I think, once a year, a little annual book. And it just my grandmother just mentioned briefly, but it's something that, she always brought, I don't know, whatever dish it was to their meetings, or she always provided this. And so you get those little, just, one or two sentences, but it does help enrich your understanding of your female ancestor through those. So that's a great idea. Look through those special collections in the local county libraries or colleges. They might have them.
I was going to say,
go ahead. I was just saying, because when if it was a community group, if if it was a specific church that your ancestors lived in or participating in essence, you can start to understand a little bit about what their beliefs were, whether it was religious or what types of causes could have been important to them. And so that was just another way to build those records, and some of those organizations kept other records, church records certainly, but some of these other community organizations like temperance societies back in the early 1800s, they had their own rosters. They would have kept their own records that you could delve into.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I was just thinking at the beginning when you were talking about letters, I just had a letter, desperate to find somebody to translate, because it's all in well, I thought French, but it's kind of like a Low German because it's from the Alsace region in the late 40s, from a cousin to my grandmother and her sisters. And, I thought, oh, maybe, you're always hoping there's going to be a little snippet of something in there for your research, but there wasn't. But it did have a lot of, it had to be around Christmas that it was written, or after Christmas, and they were talking about the gifts that were sent. And the skirts, and they were, oh, she's wearing this skirt that, and it was really neat to see what they would have sent back to the old country, to their cousins back there. So a little snippet of life. Yeah.
Exactly, that snippet of life. That's interesting. That for them that was something unique that they thought to send back. Like it kind of gives a little personality, but it does make you wonder maybe what was unique, if it was something unique about the skirts, or what the reasoning was why they chose those particular skirts to send back.
Yeah.
You also collect oral history, I believe, and I think going along with the women who are they're the storytellers, they're the ones who pass on the information in the families. I know that's so true in my family. I did record several conversations that my mother had with her sister, with my great aunt, and when I ask the men in the family the same types of questions, I don't get too much. So can you talk a little bit about why it's so important to collect those oral histories and what those bring to our research?
Oh, sure. Oral history, you're right. They are so important, and you do get such a different perspective. Sometimes the same story from different people in the family. But these oral histories are critical because they often will contain information that we cannot possibly get from a formal record. It gives us a glimpse into perhaps our ancestors' motivation or their thought process for why they moved. I've encountered, I know in some of my research, name changes. And I couldn't figure out for the longest time, I could never connect these. And finally somebody said, my grandmother told me, she's like, oh, well, he didn't like his name, so he just changed it. There was no rhyme or reason to it. There's no formality to it. It was a time when you wouldn't have had to have done it, just simply used it. She goes, I don't know, she said, but he didn't like his name, so he just decided to go by something else. And there wasn't anything, he wasn't hiding from the law, all the things that go through your mind. So it spoke to the motivation, but it also obviously bridged a gap where there were no formal records to indicate why that had happened. And of course, most of the trees out there indicate that the two men are different, and mine's, I'm the only one out there who's telling them, no, they're the same person, type thing. So, yeah.
Yeah, and trying to convince everybody else that you're right, and that's always hard.
I know, but that oral history definitely, it really does kind of help speak to the motivation of what people do, or just little things that you can discover, such as oral history, where the family cemetery is. Where an old family cemetery is. You can discover things, children who may have passed away young, you may discover the evidence of them within those stories if they were between census years, that type of thing.
Yeah. So let's go to the census. I mentioned the 1850 census before, looking for women before and after. What kind of tips do you have for looking for them before the 1850s?
Before the 1850s, do the math. That's what I tell people. You have to do the math. Yes, we can't escape our math. But it's not hard math. It's just simple addition and subtraction. So when again, you have to, because they may not be listed, they just may be a tick mark or a number in a category. When I find a household, whether it's, if I think she might be in her husband's household, or if I think that she might still be in her father's household at that point, then I actually will calculate out the map and and try to build the family out and identify who each of those tick marks represents. So, if it says there's one female under 10 years of age, well, do I know who that is? Could that be her, depending on what her age was? And I try to go through those categories and match up names and dates the best I can. So in using those date ranges, that's usually what I will do, and then try to follow it forward to see if things match up. You still have to use those other records to support it, but if you can have a consistency or not moving through those early census records, then hopefully by the time you hit the 1850, it will match up with what you've seen before. So it's tricky. There's no absolutes there. Usually I use that as a support for other records and just say, okay, yes, this is consistent with, the theory that she would be in her father's household at this point, and yes, he does have a female child of this age, but there's no way to tell directly without using other records that that's who that is.
Yeah.
Yeah. It could also help you narrow down a possible when she died, because it's so hard to find death dates sometimes for those women who died before 1850. So if you see someone in the female in the household in 1840, then okay, well, she had to die in that 10-year period there.
Right. To kind of see when somebody shows up or when they fall out off the census record. You're absolutely.
What are some of the?
Go ahead, Amy.
Oh, I was going to say, what are some of the most unusual places that we may not think of to look for female ancestors? We talked about the cookbooks and the clubs. Anything else?
I use a lot of church history records or church directories and small histories, and some of those are very local. Oftentimes I find those really at the very local level of the church itself or the local library. I'll use those, because they're just those little publications. They're local. They're not published that you can find. The other place that I like to look when I research, and I know we talked about going on site, is that I'll always try to make time to go to the library, the local library, and see if they have vertical files available, because vertical files are kind of like a catch-all, I guess, sometimes for a variety of information. And so I like to go through the vertical files because you can find all kinds of things in those things that you would think. Everything from newspaper clippings to handwritten letters to old researchers' notes to I've seen city directories in those. I've seen postcards. I've seen church rosters in those things. So I like to make sure I use those and check those out to make sure I'm not missing anything there. Because, again, those are not going to show up on any kind of formal record that you can Google or that you can search. You just pretty much have to put your eyes on those type of things. So those are some really interesting things to look at. And I think getting into, really, I like to use city directories to learn what types of organizations are in a community. So if there's a temperance society, then I can maybe try to pursue those records. Or maybe, what about the Red Cross? Do you have nurses or somebody who was part of the Red Cross? If you do, those records for your female ancestors are fabulous. They have a lot of detail in them. So those are a really good resource to use as well.
That's great. Putting your ancestor in the historical context and understanding the community in which they lived, then you can start understanding how they might have participated within the community, and then look for those records.
Right.
Yeah, those are some great sources. And I know Amy and I got to jump into some of those vertical files when we did our last trip up to New Jersey and Connecticut.
That's right, and it was through those vertical files that I found out that I'm related to Christopher Reeve's Superman.
That's right.
There was an article in one of those files that kind of talked about his ancestry, and we have a common ancestor. So, yeah, you never know what you're going to find in those vertical files. Yeah.
Amy's high point.
It really is amazing. And most people don't even think about our vertical files, but state libraries will have them. Oftentimes, local libraries have them. Genealogical historical societies have them. I just have kind of gotten in the habit now that I just always ask, because I want to make sure I'm not missing something.
And I always encourage people to, if they have written up their research, if they have research, to donate a copy to the local library wherever that research had taken them, because we need to share our information with future researchers. So, and that type of donation would end up probably in a vertical file.
Yes,
unless it's published.
And that's a great idea. That's actually a very good idea.
Yeah. I think the last question we were talking about was using children or discussion topic question, using children to find their mother Right. So sometimes you can find, when you can't find
the mother herself, you can use the children's records. I think, the first thing that we think of would be like a birth record, or the mother's going to be listed in a baptism record. If you're looking at a baptism or a christening record, you might find evidence of godparents being named, which could give you some collateral ancestors as well. I've even gone back, and so while we never skip a generation in genealogy research, if I have a female that I suspect died young or left young children, I will sort of extrapolate to see if I can find the children listed in grandparents' records, like a will or an estate type thing that would name all three generations there. So that's one way I do it. But the other thing would be to follow those children out, because while a female maybe she died and they weren't keeping death certificates at that point, but what if her children, when they passed away, they may actually have a death certificate. They would have been much later and had a death certificate. And so you can find her name, even though she would have died many years earlier, you would hopefully find her name listed on a child's death certificate, per se, that way. I have found evidence for an immigrant ancestor who came over. So the ancestor actually died back at, I'd say, 1915 or so. But when I followed her children out in through the census records, where they talk about the place of the parents' birth on the census records, those later ones, so I think in 1930, it actually mentioned the village in the old Russian Empire where the woman had been born.
You got lucky.
So, yeah, it totally took me back. That was a genealogy happy dance moment, because I was like, okay, this is really good stuff, because at that point I didn't know, they had come from the Russian Empire was all I knew, and I didn't know where. Yeah. And so now I do.
Wow,
that's fantastic.
Yeah. So I think it's sort of, whether it's the shifting your angle to the men in her life or the children, anybody who is important to your female ancestor, quite frankly, is important to us as genealogy researchers. And so sometimes we have to research out those other folks first before we can find that little clue that's hidden in their records to our female ancestor.
Right.
Absolutely.
Good point.
Absolutely.
Yeah, oftentimes we'll see them as a widow and perhaps living with one of their children, and so that's even before the 1880 census, when you don't have those relationships listed. That's a good clue as to that person, that woman is more than likely the mama.
Yes.
So
in those family groups. Yeah, I had just recently been searching for one of my ancestors that Amy told me I needed to do a little better job of digging deeper. And I found a piece of paper. It was the backside of a newspaper ad. That I don't know how the backside was empty, but it was. And someone had written out all this history. And I realized it was from either 1939 or 1940, just by pricing out some of the things that were on the ad on the backside. I could tell when it was. And the location was a city that I knew that my great-great-grandfather was at. And that one also had some of the women's names listed with their maiden names that had married in. And I was like, huzzah! So once I could see that, I could then research it and then find proof that yes, that was true, that was a married name for this person. So had I not had that, and it was great. It was just in an old envelope that my dad had given me, and I guess I'd never opened it until just this past couple weeks.
Oh wow! Yeah, there's always sometimes there's unusual things like that sometimes you get handed a bunch of things and you kind of glance, but then you don't really. At the time, you could have read it at the time and not even know, it doesn't necessarily register until you go back, have a little more background to somebody.
Yeah, absolutely. Those clues aren't clues until there's context. And like you said, you could miss it or see it the first time. It doesn't mean anything to you. And as your research continues, you go back, always go back and look at those documents again, and new things pop out.
Yeah.
So that's cool.
Always go back. Yep.
That's cool.
Well, Lisa, thank you so much for joining us and talking about researching female ancestors.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I hope everybody out there will, try some of these tactics and have some luck. And I know I'm going to be looking for recipe books because I love that idea.
Yeah.
Fabulous.
Yep.
Check Google Books.
Google Books is great. Yeah, you can. Yes, you can. You can find a lot of good stuff in Google Books for sure. So, and everyone to visit Lisa's blog, Are You My Cousin, and her website, and
her YouTube channel,
for more tips.
She's got some great videos out there.
She's sharing her knowledge and useful information and tips on those. So check those out, and we'll have links, Penny, on our website.
Yes.
Our blog.
Yes.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Good. All right. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Lisa.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening. Please email us with any questions or comments at genealogyhappyhour@gmail.com.
Visit our website, www.genealogyhappyhour.com, for additional resources, books, and wines. Don't forget to drink responsibly
and never drink around genealogical documents.